For this lecture, I'll be sharing some data-driven workflows that I typically use when I do research and other data-driven projects. The first workflow is the School of Data's data pipeline. The School of Data is a global network of data literacy practitioners composed of organizations and individuals who are committed to advancing data literacy in civil society. And the data pipeline is their approach to working with data from beginning to end. The second workflow is related to the data pipeline, particularly expounding on the steps clean, analyze, and present. This workflow is from Hadley Wickham's book entitled R for Data Science. Hadley Wickham is a statistician from New Zealand and chief scientist at RStudio Incorporated. He is best known for his development of open source software for the R statistical programming language for data visualization, including ggplot2, and other tidyverse packages, which support a tidy data approach to data science. The first step of any project is to define the main problem that you're trying to solve or question that you're trying to answer. At this stage, you might already have a general theme in mind, so you'll want to narrow it down to one or a few more specific questions. It's also best to formulate your question in a way that already hints at what kind of data will be needed. Once you have defined your question, you must use the tools and techniques available to you to find the data that you need. For example, you might use open data portals or submit a Freedom of Information request to a specific government agency. It also helps to ask within your social networks or maximize the use of search engine tools, such as Google search operators. Sometimes though, the data you have in mind might not be easily available, so it will be helpful to know what other data can be used as proxy indicators. Once you've found feasible data sources, the next step would be to get the data from its initial location and import it into your computer for processing. This can be as simple as downloading the data from government websites and online portals. It might require more work, such as crowdsourcing data through online forms or collecting data from actual surveys on the ground as well. Before moving on to the next step in the workflow, let's talk about machine-readable data. Machine-readable data, or computer-readable data, is data in a format that can be processed by a computer, such as CSV, XLS, JSON, and XML files. Machine-readable data must be structured data. Human-readable data, on the other hand, is data in a format that can be conveniently read by a human being. Some human-readable formats, such as PDF, are not machine-readable, as they are not structured data. Non-digital material, such as printed or handwritten documents, is by its non-digital nature not machine-readable. But even digital material is not always machine-readable. For example, a PDF document containing tables of data are digital but not machine-readable because a computer would struggle to access the tabular information, even though these are very human-readable. The equivalent tables in a format such as a spreadsheet would then become machine-readable. Okay, now that you have the data, it's important to verify the data. This means checking the attached metadata. Metadata is data that provides information about other data. In other words, it is data about data. Datasets often have metadata on how and by whom the data were collected, how the dataset was organized and processed, as well as descriptions of the different variables and how to interpret them. You'll also need to check for the ownership and for any licenses and permissions to use and redistribute the data. Metadata is important in verifying the reliability and usefulness of the data. It is also generally a good practice to attach your own metadata to whatever datasets you've produced or processed so that others can also verify your data. The data that you have can often be raw or messy. For example, you can have duplicated rows or observations, column names or variables that don't match the records, and values which contain characters that cannot be easily parsed. So at this point, you can use tools at your disposal in order to render the data into not just machine-readable formats, but also into a tidy dataset. Data processing commonly occurs in stages, so the quote-unquote processed data from one stage may still be considered raw data in the next stage. As researchers, we want to clean the raw data to correct for errors, account for outliers, and transform the data in order to produce information that will be meaningful for our actual analysis. So what does it mean for data to be tidy? According to Hadley Wickham, The concept of tidy data means storing data in a consistent form that matches the semantics of the dataset with the way that it is stored. In brief, when your data is tidy, each variable will have its own column, each observation must have its own row, and each value must have its own cell. Tidy data is important because the consistent structure lets us focus on gaining insights and answering questions using the data rather than struggling to parse the data. Datasets may also have different structures. Cross-sectional data involves collecting observations on many subjects, such as individuals, firms, countries, or regions, at one point in time. This is useful if we will have no regard to differences in time for our analysis, and instead focus on differences among selected subjects. Time series data are data points that are indexed or listed in time order. This means that observations are taken at successive, equally spaced points in time. This is useful if our analysis takes differences over time for one subject as primary interest, for example, in forecasting. Panel data combines both cross-sectional and time series data ideas in that they contain multidimensional data involving measurements over time. Panel data is most useful when looking at how several or many subjects might change across time. Finally, pooled cross-sectional data across time differs from panel data because while panel data deals with observations on the same subjects in different times, pooled cross-sectional data across time observes different subjects in different time periods. Having all these in mind, cleaning or processing our data will often involve transforming the data, and this includes narrowing in on observations of interest, creating new variables that are functions of existing variables, and calculating a set of summary statistics. Going through all of these steps will allow us to effectively analyze the data. It is in this step where we want to gain insights and generate knowledge relevant to the problem we defined in the very beginning. This means that we will use skills, primarily mathematical, statistical, and other domain-specific skills to dig into the data. We can use visualizations and models as complementary tools to answer our questions. For the cleaning and analyzing steps, it's important to take advantage of different tools that can help us deal with the data. This means utilizing spreadsheet processors such as Microsoft Excel or Google Sheets, statistical suites such as Stata and SPSS, and programming languages such as Python and R. Earlier, we mentioned the complementary tools of visualization and modeling in analyzing our data. Visualization allows us to find unexpected insights or raise new questions about the data. These might give us hints that we might want to ask different questions or use a different dataset instead. However, visualization is fundamentally a human activity, so it doesn't really scale well. Modeling allows us to answer questions with more precision. Models are fundamentally computational, which means that they generally scale well. However, every model will depend on assumptions, and by nature, a model cannot question its own assumptions. Again, we can utilize both visualizations and models as complementary tools in refining our analysis. The final step in our workflow is to present or communicate your analysis. Remember to think of your target audience, make clear references to your original research question or policy question, and select the appropriate medium to effectively convey your message and insights. At this point, I'll be demonstrating how a researcher or policymaker might incorporate data into their own workflow. For the purposes of this demo, I'll be using the R programming language. R is a programming language and free software environment for statistical computing and graphics supported by the R Core team and the R Foundation for Statistical Computing. The R language is widely used among statisticians and data miners for developing statistical software and data analysis. I prefer using R because it's free, meaning users are allowed to run the software for any purpose, as well as to study, change, and distribute it, and any adapted versions as well. So aside from being accessible at zero cost, there's also a large community of users that you will be able to consult through online forums, as well as a plethora of paid and free resources that you can tap into for domain-specific applications. I prefer using R over Python, for example, which is also a free programming language. Because while Python is more general purpose, R is primarily developed by and for statisticians. So it has a broad selection of packages available to you for your statistics or data-driven purposes. To download R, just go to cran.r-projects.org and select the appropriate installer for your operating system. It's also advisable to use an integrated development environment or IDE, which will help better edit and preview your code. For this, I recommend also downloading and installing RStudio. Once you've installed R and RStudio, which are both free, the program will already come with plenty of built-in functions. But once we dive deeper into more complex and sophisticated projects, we will want to install more packages. Packages can be installed on your computer using the install.packages function and loaded using the library function. One package I highly recommend is the tidyverse set of packages. So we won't dive too deeply into R, but I would recommend using the available online resources, which are free and quite beginner-friendly. I'll be including some links and references here. Alright, let's get into using our data-driven workflow. We'll be using a very simple example that will provide an overview of how to apply what we just learned. First, let's define our question. Let's say that our general policy is that we want to improve the productivity of our rice farmers. We might ask more specific questions, such as which provinces are the largest producers of rice? Or which provinces are the most efficient producers of rice? These questions are by no means exhaustive, but can lead us to the right path in being able to formulate and evaluate the policies that would address our goal. Next, we need to find the data. For Philippine agricultural data, the Philippine Statistics Authority or PSA is a good primary source. The PSA conducts periodic surveys on a broad range of crops and agricultural sectors. These surveys are then used to derive monthly, quarterly, and annual agricultural indicators, including production and yield, prices, and even stocks. The PSA analyzes the data from these surveys and publishes the results. The agency also produces wider and more aggregated datasets, such as the Census of Agriculture and Fisheries, the agricultural accounts, which are part of the macroeconomic accounts, and the various price indices as well. Other government agencies also collect and publish agricultural data. For example, the Department of Agriculture has a registry system for basic sectors in agriculture, which targets farmers, farm workers, and fisherfolk, and gathers data on demographic as well as agricultural characteristics, including livelihood, primary crops, farm area, and farm type. The National Irrigation Administration also collects data on potentially irrigable lands and also irrigation outcomes. All of these data are often published on a yearly basis and are disaggregated up to the province level. So if we wanted to drill down to more granular data, we would need to find different sources. Most of these survey or microdata are accessible via Freedom of Information request as public use files or PUF files, which can then be converted into more readable formats. Okay, so now we're ready to go through a quick demonstration using R for our data-driven workflows, in particular for agricultural policymaking. So you can see that I've opened RStudio here, and we have an open R Markdown document. So R Markdown documents are very useful for creating formatted documents such as PDF or HTML files. At the same time, you can embed R code chunks in them and show the results as well. So here's an example of the result of an R Markdown document. As you can see, there's formatted text. It includes the code chunk that we ran and the results of running this chunk of code here down. So R Markdown documents are very useful for sharing our data processes, our code, and the results as well. So for the first step of our data-driven workflow, we're going to be finding, getting, and verifying our data. In particular, for this example, we're going to use regional and provincial palay production data, which can be downloaded from the PSA's OpenStat platform. So I'll show you the OpenStat platform here. And this is what the data looks like. This data can be downloaded as CSV files. I've included the link in the R Markdown documents. Now, if we examine the data source, we will be able to see that it's maintained by the PSA's Crop Statistics Division. And the raw data set was collected from the Palay and Corn Production Survey, or PCPS. So we have two data sets, one for volume and one for area harvested. So these data sets contain quarterly palay production of each province, region, and for the Philippines from 2016 to 2020. Now that we have the data and we verified it, we can proceed to clean the data. So before we can import it, we have to first load the necessary packages into R. For example, today we're going to be using the tidyverse library. So tidyverse is not a single package, but rather it's a set of packages which are useful for importing, tidying, wrangling, transforming, and visualizing datasets in R. It will also allow us to use the pipe operator, and it will make our code more readable. So now we can import our data. So our data are in CSV or .csv files, which are comma-separated value files. These can be imported into R using the read_CSV function. We use the assignment operator, which looks like a left-pointing arrow here, to name the dataset. So each dataset can be previewed by simply typing and running the name of the data, while the view function can be used to view the entire dataset. So before importing our .csv files directly into R, it might also be useful to preview the data first. So here's the data that we have. This is our volume of production data. So as you can see, our data starts on the third row, which means that we should actually skip the first two rows in order to load our data properly. Furthermore, most of our data are numerical, but there are some missing values or some missing data. So these missing data take on the values dot or two periods. And if we don't indicate which values represent missing values, then the data or the variables will be loaded completely as strings or characters rather than the numeric data that we're expecting. So let's run this code. Again, using the assignment operator, we'll assign the data that we've loaded into these variables or data sets. So palay_volume and palay_area, which we can also see here in our environment panel. Again, our markdown documents will show us the preview of our datasets or our code as we run them. And another useful function in cleaning the data would be, of course, to look at the summary statistics of the data. So a quick method to do this would be to use the summary function, which will show us the type or class of each variable. And for numeric data, it will provide some useful statistics like the minimum, maximum, mean, median, and other statistics as well. So now we can move on to the next step, which is to tidy or transform our data. So one important step is to make sure that the variable names or column headers are adequately descriptive, while also being easily accessible or understandable. When we open the CSV file, we notice that several of the column headers contain the quarter labels. So you can see here, 2016 quarter 1, 2016 quarter 2, and so on. Now, this isn't tidy yet. So in order to make our data tidy, we want a single column to indicate our quarter variable and another column to indicate our actual data. So this means we want to reshape or pivot our data from being wide to long. So we can use the pivot_longer function. We also want to clean the column headers that contain any white spaces or special characters, such as the slash, percent, parentheses, and other special characters. We want to avoid these white spaces or special characters, as this will require enclosing our variable names and backticks later on in order to access them. So for this, we can use the rename function to change our variable names to a format that we like. So let's run this code again. Now, since these two data sets are related, we can use the full_join function to merge them. Both data sets have three variables in common: crop type, geolocation, and quarter variables. And in combination, these three variables will uniquely identify our data or our observations. And these will be used as keys in the full join function. Now, another step in tidying the data is to ensure that the unit of analysis for the data
are uniform and relevant to us. Currently, the data contains both the national and regional palay production data as well. So we can narrow down our data set to only provincial data using the filter function. We notice that the geolocation values, which represent provinces, begin with a string of 4 dots or 4 periods, while region values begin with 2. So again, we can look at our data set and notice the pattern here. So provincial data starts with 4 periods, and regional data starts with 2, while the Philippines has no periods in the name. So using the string or str_detect function will help in detecting regular expressions and string patterns in our variables. So we use the combination of filter and string detect. So let's run this code. Now, we can also use the mutate function to generate new variables and transform existing variables. So we can combine mutate with other functions to help us further clean up the geolocation variable. For example, we can remove the filter data by removing the periods using string remove all. We can remove the footnote indicators, for example, that might be present in our data. And we can also reduce or remove the white spaces using the string_trim function. We also want to make sure that our variables are accurately storing information. For example, our quarter variable, again, our labels here at the beginning, 2016, quarter 1, quarter 2, and so on. We can convert that into an actual date format by using the YQ function, which is part of the lubridate package. So if you have tidyverse, you have to load lubridate separately as well. So this will make it easier to visualize and model time series data, especially if you have variables that indicate date. So we can run the code here. Finally, we can further transform our dataset by generating new variables from existing ones. For example, we can create a volume per area or yield variable by dividing volume by area. We can also create rank and percentile rank variables using the min_rank and %_rank functions. Remember that we want to create these ranking variables for any given quarter or period within these quarter or periods. So we use the group by function first to group our dataset by quarter. So we create a new variable, and then we create a grouping based on quarter, and then we create the ranking variable. So let's run this code. Note that the generated rank variable combines min_rank and the descend function, or DESC. It combines both of these when we run our code so that the highest rice producing provinces will be first, and the second most productive will be second, and so on. For the percentile variables that we generated, we interpret it as the nth percentile province produced more palay than n% of the other provinces. By identifying the provinces which produce the most rice or palay, we know which areas rice-related or agricultural policies will potentially affect, so we can target them better. Finally, once we've transformed, tidied our data, and cleaned our data, we can move on to visualizing and communicating our data. So visualizations are an effective way of communicating insights to policymakers, stakeholders, and other human beings in general. For this, we want to use the ggplot package, which is part of the tidyverse. The ggplot package contains very elegant and useful plotting functions in R. So here's an example of using the ggplot package. Here's a plot of 20 provinces that produced the most rice during the fourth quarter of 2020. And by most rice, we're talking about volume here. So as you can see, Nueva Ecija is the top rice producing province in the fourth quarter of 2020, followed by Pangasinan, Isabela, Iloilo, and Tarlac. We can also plot a time series. Again, we had a date variable earlier, or a quarter variable, and now that since we've converted it to a date format, we can use it to plot it in a time series format. So what I did here is I filtered the top 4 rice-producing provinces, and I wanted to see the time series of these provinces. So you can see which provinces have spikes in certain quarters. For example, most of them have highest production in the fourth quarter. And you can see also the differences in the trend of these variables for these provinces. So once we've run all of our code in R, we can also knit our markdown document into a format that we like HTML or PDF. And once we have a PDF or HTML file, we can actually share or send our results to those we want to communicate these results to. So this will include our code, this will include our process, our data-driven workflow, as well as the results. And if we also include our dataset, they can also rerun the code and replicate or reproduce the data-driven workflow that we have produced. So this was a very quick demonstration or tutorial of using R for a data-driven workflow in agricultural policymaking. Thank you very much.
All right. At this point, we have a good overview of how to incorporate data into our research and policymaking processes. The general steps of the data pipeline are define, find, get, verify, clean, analyze, and present our data. We can use programs like R to load, process, and analyze our data. This has been quite a brief discussion, but hopefully you are better equipped and more motivated to use data to answer various questions, as well as to formulate and evaluate the policies at hand. Thank you very much.